So, welcome back to another episode of Power Tripping. We've had a little break since our last one, so there's been some developments, some changes, some things have happened. So we can jump right into it, but I think maybe we'll recap a little bit from the first half. But I think before we get to any of that, we wanted to take a beat and acknowledge that Lily is now in the big hosty seat of New York Mag's Power Trip and Symposia's Power Trip.
Woot woot.
Has the
power.
Yeah.
And I am tripping on it.
So, for folks who haven't heard the first half of season 1 of New York Mag and Symposia's cover story Power Trip, probably go listen to those episodes and then listen to the first 5 Power Trippings. You can jump into this one straight away if you want. There may be some missing context. We absolutely cannot stop you.
There are limits to our powers.
But I guess just briefly, the first half dealt with issues in the psychedelic underground, focusing largely on the consciousness medicine cult. And in this second half, we're going to be moving far more into things that are taking place above ground. But a lot of the dynamics and more systemic or structural issues are very much still at play and still in the frame. So I think a lot of the dynamics and issues in the first half really inform some of the understandings that the second half is building out and will continue to build out. So I guess rather than just jumping into it as somebody who has been swimming in this shit for way too long, I want to just throw it out there for y'all, like as far as what like immediate takeaways from episode 6.
It was a roller coaster for sure. I mean, it's really, one thing I heard from a lot of people's reactions to it was how striking it was to hear the first person accounts. And I'm sure, we're going to get into that more, but I did want to, before we get into the darker, gritty stuff, say how I did get a bit nostalgic in the beginning, hearing from, more about, it was nice to hear more of you, Dave, and your background in the outset, talking about, and I really like the way Lily set that up in terms of like, there was this, community of a sorts in those early days while it was still fairly taboo and kind of coming together around conferences, and just hearing how impactful those early mushrooms had been for you. It was nice to have it start out that way and acknowledging that there were these kind of life-changing benefits that, but that's not the full story.
Well, yeah. And also it was nice to see all of that sort of juxtaposed with clinical trials, because Dave, your experiences weren't in a clinical trial, were they?
They were not. And at the same time, I thought it was a nice opportunity to really emphasize the issues that we've talked about repeatedly as Symposia when it comes to issues of authority and legitimacy, and the way that having that legitimate scientific research to point to, whether talking with my parents or, at the same time I was at university, right? Like talking to my professors, being able to come into the class with peer-reviewed papers and say, hey, like, let's talk about drugs. And here I've got like legit institutional cover that these ideas belong in the realm of research. I think it's hard to overstate how significant that sort of legitimacy can be.
Yeah, Nishay, you use the word nostalgia, and it's true. Like, I think we all kind of can remember when, conferences were small. You rocked up and it was like you knew many of the people there because you'd seen them around, and like there was a real there was a sense of community. It's hard to know how real it was, especially in retrospect. but like a sense of shared interest, a sense of shared passion and curiosity, and coming together to like be nerds about this thing we were all kind of into that was like kind of fringy and kind of weird. And it's changed. The terrain has changed.
Yeah.
I think, in a sort of less nostalgic sense, like looking at some of those histories at the beginning of the show, like one of the things I've really been appreciating over the last couple weeks in particular, I mean, it goes back longer, but the work that we have done collectively to put some of these stories on the record and some of the histories on the record in ways where they can be easily pointed to with a URL to a single article, and you have the collection of accounts. Like when we were talking about the number of people, how few people were in phase 2 of MAPS clinical trials. I mean, that was, I remember that moment and being able to say, people were saying, wait, can you point to that? And I realized we had a series of articles that Russ had written. It's just a handy resource, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
God, y'all are gonna.
Some of it is just that this episode was particularly raw, and and I want to acknowledge sort of the gravity of like moving into the world of clinical trials and laboratories. There's so much of people's like hopes and careers, and the amount of like pushback that has really only just begun, that we have already seen and anticipated, is unsurprising. And yet I think a question that we've been asking over and over again is are these just collateral damage stories we're hearing from some great mission, or is this something that I mean, I think it's a rhetorical question. This deserves the kind of attention that you all have put on it.
Yeah, the phrase collateral damage has come up a lot. Meaghan Buisson was one of the first people to really put that idea down and really make the point that like we're not collateral damage, that's not really a thing. And I think it's heavy and it's difficult because it's like so much of the public narrative around MAPS in particular hinges on healing lots and lots of people who are the most hurt and the most in need of relief. And especially when you like bring some of these stories into conversation with the way that MAPS is branding themselves, it's like, wait, like I thought that this was about addressing suffering. So why is it that these accounts of suffering are not being addressed?
Why indeed?
Yeah, and I mean, beyond that, it's why are these accounts not being addressed, but also the barriers that are being erected, not just by an organization that claims to be invested in the well-being of potentially millions and millions and millions of people, but also like doing good quality trauma research. I think like one of the things that has struck me throughout the course of talking with different study participants is the degree to which coming forward in these cases isn't just a matter of like being able to engage with the sort of difficult, challenging material at hand. It's also dealing with the realities of the PR narrative that exists around MAPS and the notion that, Dawley has said on the record at various points, this is going to usher in a spirituality for the billions. To begin to challenge that narrative is, to my mind, a rather significant weight to bear, and for anyone to bear on their own. And remember, in the context of clinical trials, participants shouldn't know who the other participants are. So they are effectively isolated, atomized on their own. And if you're in a clinical trial for severe PTSD, just in coming forward to make that acknowledgement, you are already acknowledging and making a significant disclosure about your own mental health and your own, like the issues you've dealt with in life. And there's a lot that comes with that when you look at the stigma and the social responses to that. And so I think, like, when you look at all of the things that stack up, and then if you look, I mean, just to talk about Meaghan's story has been in the public for a while. Meaghan's story is in the public in part because of work that people on this team have done to get it out there and to highlight it. And even with some of those pushes, I think MAPS has made all of 2 statements, effectively, like two actual public statements, official formal replies, whatever, in the years, neither of which, to my mind, ever really addressed the issues at hand. I mean, they describe it as a sexual relationship between a trial participant and her study therapist. Like, excuse me, what? Like, we're talking about a therapeutic relationship. There is no consensual sexual relationship here. And the fact, to what Lily was saying earlier about, like, who has gotten to frame and shape these narratives, and who what do you call it? Like the effects of that, like, right, when MAPS frames that narrative, they have a large PR apparatus, they have access to media, and that is what gets out there. So then when other people pull from those statements and reiterate MAPS's talking points, they, whether intentionally or unintentionally, reproduce some of those harmful dynamics, even if we want to say it's just an exclusion or just an exclusion or a misframing. Like, the way in which that is replicated and reproduced, in some cases without thought, is in and of itself harmful.
The couple of statements that they have put out too have been, like you said, kind of like vague and in their own defense for the most part. Like, I feel like their statements talk about, like, cutting ties with Jensen and Dreyer as if that were like a quick thing that they just did, like, as soon as they heard the first inkling of something going wrong. And when in reality that doesn't seem to be the case. It seemed to take quite a process for them to kind of cut those ties. And you lose a lot in that parroting of just their PR statements that they're putting out and not hearing from.
I've known MAPS people, I've worked with MAPS people closely. Something that Psymposia doesn't like, something that people outside of looking at Psymposia now don't realize. And MAPS is a psychedelic propaganda machine. Like, that's what they are. That's why they're so successful. They know how to do it. And kind of dislodging some of these narratives, I think, might become even more difficult now with the resources that they have, the investment that they just received, the relationships that they have with, like, big heavy hitters, and as far as public relations, and the deal that they've worked with Saatchi and Saatchi before to craft public narratives. They've worked with Boston Consulting Group. These people, like, they know what they're doing. It's going to become even more difficult, I think, moving forward, unless more media actually looks at it. And the other thing is, while it's not included, I was just looking while you guys are talking at MAP's mission statement. It's not about the benefits and the risks. It's about the benefit from careful uses of psychedelics and marijuana. But all the rhetoric about everybody talking about the risks of psychedelics or MDMA, there's not that much in the discourse about the risks. A lot of it is just kind of pushed aside. And like you said, yeah, that MAPS has kind of been silent on a lot of this. And that statement that they put out initially was called Statement, Public Announcement of Ethical Violation by Former MAPS Sponsored Investigators, if anyone actually wants to look at that.
We'll post a link.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out in the context of the PR machine and all of that, that like some of the history, like people, and we've talked about it a fair bit, but like people not realizing that the dyad stems, the therapist dyad stems from legacies of sexual abuse by MDMA therapists, you know, and the therapists in question, like Ingrassi was the poster boy for MDMA therapy. I mean, he was doing congressional hearings. he was, you know, like this
Yeah.
is not, and yet
He
go
helped
ahead.
start like 2 major psychology groups around that area and everything too. Yeah. Sorry, Lily.
It's just like something I think is a little bit it made sense when I read about it and started to put the pieces together, but like, you know, we sort of say like, oh yeah, it was like a small community of people over many decades that have kind of known each other, but like going back and looking and reading and being like, oh, like I know half of these people who were on the board of this early iteration of pre-maps of the Earth Metabolic Design Labs, or like realizing, oh, that there was this 1985 gathering of people at the Esalen Institute to try to talk about the emergency scheduling of MDMA and like organize against it. And it's Ingrassi and DeLeo and Jensen and Doblin and Greer, and like it just there's like the same names just come up over and over again, that these are people who, much like Psymposia, like where we're in touch with each other and we know each other and we have strong social relationships, like so too with them. These are social groups that are passionate about the thing that they're passionate about, and that go way back to like before I was born. So I think that's an important thing to realize too, is like, you know, Rick Ingrassi's abuses were talked about in the Boston Globe in the late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
He was like an associate of Doblin and these other people throughout the 80s. He was testifying to Congress, like, and the point I'm trying to make here is like these guys all knew each other, and like the fact that there were abuses happening was a thing that would have been like a thing that people were, you know, talking about one way or another within these circles. And so, you know, it's just ridiculous the extent to which it hasn't been grappled with. It's just been like papered over.
And when we're talking about abuses being papered over, I think too, like highlighting the fact that and we've seen it with our coverage of Martin Ball and the notion, you know, there were at least a couple people who were publicly saying that, you know, Ball wasn't such a concern compared to, say, Octavio Rettig, because Rettig had actually killed people, but Ball hadn't. And, you know, I'm just struck by the number of people in these communities who seem only willing to draw the line when it comes to things like death or rape, or like the harms don't count until it gets to that point. And in talking with the participants who came forward and shared their stories with us around their clinical trial experiences, the amount of harm that comes from therapist misconduct or impropriety, things like fostering dependence, things like gaslighting participants or clients, and the sponsor organization, you know, the types of responses that go down, like the amount of harm when you're talking about folks who are dealing with severe trauma and who are looking for, who may have believed the various lines about MDMA assisted therapy being a miracle cure, having phenomenal rates of healing. I mean, I just want to, I don't think there's been enough discussion, broadly speaking, about the potentials for harm beyond the notion of like expectancy, beyond the notion of like, oh, well, people might not get what they're looking for. People, you know, may find that as they unpack some of these traumas, it's difficult stuff. Like there's no real meaningful discussion of different aspects of touch or therapist dependence or emotional like the lack, like what happens when people are sloppy with boundaries. Like I think looking both at part 1 and part 2, like when I look at the harms that have been done, there are clear ongoing issues from people who have, from therapists or practitioners who have refused or failed to set boundaries. And when I compare some of those harms to some of the practitioners who have set boundaries, where there are still harms, what I see is like it's like a different scope of mess. You know, it's like the non-boundaried practitioners have facilitated these sort of ongoing unfoldings of like cascading harms basically by their unwillingness or inability to set those boundaries. And it's just, when I see people like Elizabeth Nielsen from Fluence say we don't need to worry about the therapeutic component until we get this approved and then we'll sort of figure out the therapy, that's concerning to me. That seems like a huge blind spot.
I mean, and as far as maps, like I'm not surprised at any of the boundary violations that have existed in the clinical trials. This is an organization that, you know, people go to the festivals together and everybody does drugs together with one another. You know,
that's on the record, by the way.
That's what the cool kids do.
Look, when I think about maps, the explosive growth, and if you're sort of new to this space, you got to understand that maps in the last, I don't know, 6-7 years has undergone like a period of explosive growth. Just a handful of years ago, their budgets were like very small. And when you look at how much money they're raising and just the growth that they've had in the last few years, I think to me, the culture that existed there, which was like this hippy dippy kind of new age, just, you know, boundary kind of blurred boundary kind of organization, that itself, that culture has scaled. And so when I think about them, I think of a company like Uber that has, you know, had this terrible work culture of sexual harassment and misogyny and all this, and how that has exploded. And you can see, I also think of Vice. That's a kind of a similar company that underwent, you know, massive investments, and they scaled that kind of internal slop culture. And look, like I said before, I've worked with MAPS closely, and I've had MAPS employees before, like, just explain to me how sloppy the organization is. And I've experienced it as well. So it doesn't, like, this doesn't surprise me to see these things happening in clinical trials when I've been able to kind of look under the hood and just been around that organization and been in the space where I've been studying that organization now for the past 8 years.
And it comes from the top, right? Like, how many times have we experienced Rick Doblin defending, you know, people who have been alleged to have done serious, significant harms? Like, if we look at the people who have allegations of sexual abuse or impropriety.
Or admissions in the case of Pinchback.
Yeah, and Rick has raced to defend them time and time again. And, you know, like, we have emails, we have... we've been in conversations with him, and like it's just it just hasn't mattered. Like, nobody's been willing to.
Things don't matter when you're on a spiritual mission to turn on billions of people. The few, they don't matter.
Just to steer the ocean liner of humanity away from the iceberg. Yeah, it's simple math.
And MAPS, from the moment that I kind of learned about them, has felt like they were on that kind of that spiritual mission, and they had their toes in a lot of different baskets. Like, they were doing kind of like peer support projects and some stuff related to spirituality. And like you said, now they're scaling into the organization that's kind of at the center of the boom of corporadelics and planning to be the people supplying MDMA to like the first generation of this industry. And like they've gone from this kind of like hippy dippy spiritual organization with some science happening to now they're kind of at the heart of this corporadelic industry that's forming. And a lot of people, their success is kind of informing a lot of these other companies that are springing up, and they could fail and the industry would probably still stick around, but if they succeed, there's a lot more money in it for a lot of people, and now I don't know, their importance has kind of skyrocketed very fast, I think, and their culture has
they have the
it.
perception of having the moral high ground in the industry as well.
Because they're a nonprofit.
It's a weird model. I don't want to unpack the whole thing actually, but they're both a nonprofit and a for-profit. But if you actually looked at that objectively, like the for-profit is orders of magnitude larger than the nonprofit, but technically the nonprofit owns the for-profit. So I don't want to get into.
But the nonprofit's starting to cut certain projects in favor of the for-profit, and
maybe
anyways.
It's a mess. Just the way that this stuff gets downplayed and dismissed. Like, for example, in talking with, raising that question about what happens when there's a mismatch between CAPS scores and lived experience, right? Like, what happens when what's on paper doesn't match reality? And like, we're going to get more into that next week too. But I just want to point out that, like, in talking to other researchers, they've been quite clear that's what the discussion section of peer-reviewed papers is for. Like, that's where you can sort of lay into it, especially when we're talking about trauma research and the understanding that, like, there's going to be some reductiveness in the measurements used and this, that, and the other. But if we look through MAPS's presentations and papers and the public engagement with their research, where are these participants' experiences reflected?
It gets into some of the, like, so my background is primarily in qualitative research, and when you look at, like, CAPS is a quantitative measurement instrument, and if there's a big disparity between what your quant is telling you and what your qualitative data is telling you, like, that's interesting to the typical dyed-in-the-wool researcher who has, like, a thirst to understand the phenomenon under investigation. That's really interesting. That's not a thing that gets brushed aside. That's not a thing that gets ignored. It's a thing that's like, let's zoom in really close here and get as much information about what's going on here as possible. The notion that, like, it would just be like, oh, well, the quant says this other thing, so we're just going to go with that, is like, wait, what? Like, you could be missing out on a significant breakthrough in understanding because you're just not willing to ask more questions.
And it's even bigger than that aspect too, right? Because it's like, that's sort of like how they've chosen to sit with or dissect or not, or interpret or not the various experiences that are being presented. But I think actually we can start further upstream and actually look at the protocol. So something that we didn't get into on the podcast at all, on Power Trip at all, is that the IRB, the Institutional Review Board that approved this, is not a university IRB. It is not what it is the WCG IRB. That's the Western Copernicus Group Institutional Review Board. And this is an industry-funded IRB that is, if memory serves, funded by Novo Nordisk, the pharma company. And they are explicit.
I believe it's funded by that foundation. Am I right on that? The Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is actually bigger than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I believe.
Yes, that's my memory as well. And so the WCG IRB homepage bills itself as the leader in IRB and IBC review services. It's a WCG IRB Connexus is a revolutionary submission portal built from the ground up based on feedback from our clients. The result? Ease of use, speed of submission, basically like this notion that you can race to approval because you can reduce your submission time by 50% with the WCG IRB connexus, right? Like this is what regulatory capture looks like.
Wait, we should tell people
I'm
what
sure
an
there are
IRB
people. Yeah, that's what
Institutional Review Board.
Okay, so in a university setting, for example, you would have an institutional review board, an IRB. Another way this gets talked about sometimes is an ethics committee. So this is a group of people who convene on a semi-regular basis, like maybe monthly, and then they review applications from across disciplines. And sometimes they're like, I've been at a university I was in had different streams. So like if you were doing research that involved human research subjects, that was one stream. And if you were doing something that like intervened on those subjects versus like a more observational study, like I think they delineated those. So the point is that you have like a group of your peers who are professionals across different fields, and their job is to look at an application you submit, and that application is supposed to foresee potential risks, talk about how you're going to mitigate them. You're supposed to show that you know the subject matter, you know the risks that are involved, you have a plan for dealing with it, you've thought through multiple contingencies, and that your research subjects are going to be safe. And that IRB is also therefore, like, by approving your research, they have some responsibility for ensuring that it's carried out ethically. So if there's a problem with
the safety of participants.
That's right. So
go on.
they could be receiving complaints, for example, from people who had negative experiences in a research trial. Now, what we're talking about with WCG IRB is that it's an external private company that's not associated with a university, where people are paying to play and submit applications that are then reviewed by I don't know who.
So I want to just clarify one thing, which is the history of IRBs, institutional review boards. They were standardized in 1972 by something called the National Research Act in the United States. And this was in the wake of things like the Church Committee. This literally goes back to the discussion by Congress and the revelations to the public of MK Ultra and unethical human experimentations with psychedelics. It was not only MK Ultra, but that was very much a tipping point for this work. It also included the experiments at Tuskegee, human radiation experiments, and much of what happened earlier with the Nazis. But institutional review boards, in very much part of their history, is to prevent abuses with psychedelics.
And here we are.
Yeah.
60 years later.
I think it was Justin
Not
Timberlake
quite.
that said, "What goes around, goes around, goes around, comes all the way back around."
Oh my God.
Woo!
What about the choice of dosing? Like the way that, so like, we spoke with somebody who told us initially they said it wasn't a choice, and then they said, oh, well, I guess it is a choice as far as whether or not participants go up in their dosing. Like,
yeah, so that was covered. That was covered on this episode,
right?
Yeah.
And if you read the, but it didn't feel. I want to be clear, like, and you can hear it in some of Leah's quotes on the subject matter. Like, it didn't feel like a choice for Leah. It didn't feel like it was. And I think she says something like, do I have to? And it's well, okay, like you're the knowledgeable experts, and I just, looking at the doses, I mean, the notion of 120 milligrams plus a 60 milligram booster of MDMA being standard, particularly in the wake of 80 milligrams with a 40 milligram booster, resulting in like somebody processing more trauma than other participants may have processed in the course of their entire
Yeah, that's what I thought was kind of strange about that option, was like how that just seems so strange if you're trying to quantify data, like similar data, to give some people the option to go up and not if you don't want to, because then how do you compare participants at all?
You don't.
So
we're going to talk more about that
next week. But I do want to point out one, and this is not in next week's discussion, but one MAP staffer actually got rather seemed to get offended or upset when I suggested that they were pooling heterogeneous data even within phase 3. When I said 80-40 with 120-60, like we're talking about like different doses, it seems that at least some MAPS staffers or Benefit Corp staffers don't really see it that way. And so we do have this question of like, how rigorous is rigorous? Like how good of a protocol is it, and who gets to make those distinctions, assertions, claims? And I mean, and to be clear, like this is not just an issue with MAPS. This is an issue with pharmaceuticals more broadly. But I think the way that it's playing out here and looking at some of the questions that come up around this protocol and who approved it and how it's written.
I mean, the old phrase "good enough for government work" comes to mind. I mean, ultimately, the goal is to approve these medicines. That is, that's the whole process, and it's because they absolutely do believe that these medicines work. They're going through the process that is mandated by the FDA, but I guarantee you that if that process was less stringent, they would be happy to go through that process. Rick Doblin has spoken at length about that, and I think the issue here is not one of should the drug war function the way it is and should these substances be illegal. It is, should they be approved for medical conditions and prescribed by doctors and paid for by insurance?
Well, and that's just it, right? Like what's leading people into these trials? Like what are the narratives? What are the when you have participants who are saying, wait, so what does this mean as far as like healing my own trauma? Like, am I really going to be without trauma? What, next Monday? Is this the kind of thing where like I go in, I go out, and I'm cured? Like, and
I
go ahead.
Continue.
Well, just Lily's point about come all ye most vulnerable. Like, it's not just that like that narrative pushes people into the underground because there aren't above ground therapy options. Like, this is the same problem with everybody who's racing to promote access. Access for what? For an understudied novel psychotherapeutic intervention? Like, and the fact that people are pushing for the access for these understudied psychotherapeutic interventions for the most marginalized populations. I mean, Pace brought up the Tuskegee syphilis experiment earlier. Like,
and actually, in earlier discussions, we talked about The Constant Gardener, which is an excellent movie about pharmaceutical experimentation in Africa. But please go on.
Well, I just think it's when I hear people like Sam Chapman from Oregon's Measure 109, I think he was the former campaign manager, talking about how, Measure 109 is a stand-in sort of therapy for people who don't currently have good access to healthcare. Where's the evidence that it's effective for anything? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what things are you claiming this is going to be a therapeutic remedy for? And like, this seems to tie into legacies of this sort of experimentation on populations that don't have access to healthcare. And frankly, like, if you care about access to healthcare, go like work on Medicare for all, like not psychedelics as a stand-in for actual evidence-based medicine. Like that, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And yet it seems that there is such a battle for optics that everybody wants to be the first to argue equitable access without even considering equitable access to what.
Yeah, just to paste the point that you made a minute ago is there's a complete disconnect in my mind anyways between like the legality of the medicine and the criminality of the substance. And Dave, the series, Russell series that you pointed out, you pointed Russell's series out in the podcast, and you also mentioned it before. One of the I forget the name of the I have it right here.
Do you remember when we found that out? I remember
Yeah, so
the three of us being shocked.
So Russell wrote an article. It's a 4-part series, but if you look up the article, "How will MDMA be rescheduled in the future?" you may be disappointed. So just to the point I just made about the difference between like the legality of the medicines and the criminality of the substance overall, you don't need to support like the medicalization of this right now. If you actually want like the legal aspect, because there's going to be a bifurcation with MDMA. So if MDMA goes through and is approved by the FDA, your MDMA is 100% illegal. And that's worth pointing out, because I actually don't think a lot of people realize that. Yeah, so the only MDMA that would actually be technically legal would be MAPS MDMA, and the Schedule 1 of MDMA would bifurcate there. So MDMA on the street or whatever, that's all completely illegal. Only like therapeutic MAPS MDMA would be legal.
Would be moved to Schedule 2 or maybe 3, something like that. Yeah, this
is a
little speculative, but go ahead, Russ.
I was just going to say there's similar cases of that, I think, with like Xyrem, I believe it's called, for narcolepsy. I think that's GHB with sodium oxybate, but GHB is still illegal technically, but Xyrem is a prescribable medication as long as it's like with the sodium oxybate. So that's similar to how MDMA will be bifurcated to some extent.
So, I mean, related to this, that I think in a way connects more directly to some of the stories we heard in this episode, is like, so healthcare is is one of the institutionalizations of caregiving. Okay, and we all experience nurturing, or hopefully we have all experienced nurturing in life. And that's how we literally survive. We're social creatures. This includes, nursing us when we are ill. And what is being proposed with psychedelized mental health is a magnification of a very particular kind of caregiving. And the people who are part of these narratives talk about like things like soul work, but then modulate that language for the medical field. And the stories that we heard of Meaghan, telling that story about being hugged in the clinical trial. On the one hand, through one lens, it sounded like this shift, like perhaps something like integrative medicine, where something more holistic like yoga or mindfulness is finally getting the recognition. Of course, we all need human touch, right? But we're not talking about the human touch from accountable people in your community or from people who love you. Like, these are people that you're interfacing with through, in this case, a clinical trial, with the goal of making this a legal medicine that you will interface with through a for-profit system in the United States, or perhaps a government system, say in Europe. And so this, like, the reality of what is being proposed here is like a extreme magnification of people's emotional states and the management and intervention of those drugged emotional states by professionals, right? We do have standards for, ethical standards for therapists that clearly were violated in the case that Meaghan, Meg Mel and Leah all shared. But what is it? I think that just to close, like what we saw was one synopsis of how something like that can go very, very wrong, and how it's very difficult to standardize something like that. So it's human relationships where even the therapists themselves start to lose the thread.
Well, and in the case of Meaghan's therapists, right, one of them wasn't a licensed therapist. One of them, Jensen was reported to have let his license lapse in 2009, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And MAPS was presenting him as a psychologist on the website. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, this hug thing is really interesting because there is, I think, in some of these more holistic health kind of spaces, assumptions about like touch being universally good. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, if you're dealing with a traumatized population, one of the really important injuries associated with trauma is the loss of control. And one of the really important features of doing work with people, and I'm not even speaking like therapeutically because I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, but in the sexual violence space, a victim and survivor centered approach is trying to really center the autonomy of the person who has been harmed and to try to do what you can to support them in having a sense of control. So rather than saying, you should go to the police and you should report this, it's like you could say, hey, would you like to know some of the different options that you might have for reporting? And then they can say yes or no. And if they say yes, you can say, well, you might do this and you might do this. And is there any of these you want to talk more about? So it's like, it's really, so I think like, and this is a thing we'll talk a lot more about next week, but it's like, the notion that a therapist is initiating a hug and physical contact at the outset with a trauma patient, like a person who has PTSD, like there's already something there that's like, well, wait a second, what about what this person's comfort is, and it's in the MAPS manuals, like that touch should be negotiated and talked about and at the request of the participant. So that the therapists are being responsive to touch. They're not initiating touch.
That's something that stood out to me in this episode right away is Donna Dreyer, like giving just a hug right off the bat. It's kind of crazy. But again, it's not crazy when you look at sort of what, the MDMA community and those blurred boundaries anyways,
It doesn't excuse it, though. These people are trained professionals. They have been trained, and they are part of, government government overseen clinical trials.
So let's take a beat and talk about like what that training is, because the Chacruna Institute just put out an article about Salvador Roquette's unorthodox therapies and about how this is some important legacy that we need to remember because it was, he was wrongly demonized and mistreated and incarcerated for no reason. And it was the jealous people who didn't like his methods who took issue, right? Like when we're talking about Jensen's training, like he's written extensively on Salvador Roquette, right? Like this is somebody who adhered to and believes or seems to believe the tenets of Roquette's methodologies. And the fact that like this was known, like talking to people in that broader Canadian community, we can put air quotes around community, like there is an understanding of what Jensen and Dreyer were doing at the Arenda Institute, the retreat that they run on their land, and the reliance on Roquettian methodologies. And so like the fact that he was brought into this study despite not having a license, and then went on to, in court documents, basically say, there's no duty of care because I'm not a doctor. I just play one in clinical trials.
I just play one.
I mean, it's not verbatim what it says, but when you read it, he
obviously. But yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Sorry, so I trying to think about like how these things will be
picked apart by people who don't like us very much.
Exactly. And so I want to be clear, like the fact that Chacruna is running image rehabilitation on somebody who tortured people for the Mexican state and somebody whose methodologies have come to bear not just on numerous political dissidents, but also now on clinical trial participants in what are supposed to be the safest, most buttoned up settings in which this research is being done. And the sponsor organization just didn't realize this. People around him knew, like,
but
what?
like let's think about this Chacruna move for a second, because as far as I can see, the last time that Chacruna platformed Yvonne Roquette, Salvador Roquette's daughter, was in a lecture that she gave with Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer in 2018. I find it.
Where was that lecture?
That was given, well, I don't know. It was in South America, I think.
I just meant it was a Chacruna conference.
Oh, yeah. It was a Chacruna sponsored event. And I think, like, I find it disgusting that at a point where, we've talked about Salvador Roquette, and now we're kind of moving into discussion of the clinical trials. The promo was already out. People kind of had a sense of where the show was going. And Chacruna, where there's like some close ties to MAPS, decides to drop an article by a woman who like is an associate of Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer. I couldn't believe that when I saw it. I was so angry because it was like what they are basically doing is saying like, well, we know who we're standing with. We know what we think is okay. We want to defend these methods and these practices with full knowledge that they have ties to Jensen and Dreyer and what they did to Meaghan. That is what the psychedelic community thinks is acceptable behavior. That is the stake that they have put in the ground.
Also, just want to point out that Chacruna's executive director, Bia Labate, also is an employee at MAPS as well.
Yeah, she's the public education and culture specialist for MAPS.
And we should also revisit this. Actually, while shocking, perhaps isn't that surprising, given that Chacruna in direct.
Are you talking Pinchbeck related thing?
Yeah,
they interviewed Pinchbeck about his kind of sexual issues right after he came out about them, and kind of helped rehabilitate his image to an extent. Did they not?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, like after his, after the event that he was scheduled to hold with the third wave, there was a friendly article that was extremely ironically named "Confronting Sexual Assault in the Psychedelic Community," and what was there was just an interview with Daniel Pinchbeck. So, yeah.
And then just the other thing quickly about sort of Roquette and how Roquette's methods and philosophy has been integrated and all that, and the other thing, which I've pointed out a bunch of times now, but it's my understanding that the best trips are the bad trips. That's a Roquette. That's a Roquette like
Roquettism.
Yeah, that's fundamental to his practices, and MAPS has been the promoters more so, maybe not more so than anyone. MAPS has been a big promoter of there's no such thing as bad trips, there's challenging experiences, and you can see how that language has been softened up and cleaned up throughout the years. But that's very central in therapy.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the Zendo stuff is concerning, not just because they're, like looking at the history and things that have gone down with Zendo and looking at the fact that they're now supposedly training first responders or something in Colorado, but like looking at the way that MAPS has set different things up and then built those structures out, like to bring it back to the protocol for a minute, right? Like looking at what happened when there was a protocol that left open the question of, can study therapists do ongoing therapy with study participants, which I this is something I've never heard before. I've never heard that like the notion that it is ethically acceptable for research therapists to then have research participants continue on with them in private practice is not, I mean, admittedly, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a researcher, but it's also not something that the clinicians and researchers that I've spoken with seemed familiar. Well, so this is addressed. This does get addressed because there's the idea that so Mel was told that she couldn't continue doing therapy because it was a conflict of interest, which is what goes to the ethicist, and we will get into that more next week. Leah was told no, but eventually yes, which does take some unpacking, and we will get there. And then in the case of Meaghan, Jensen and Dreyer said yes, and we're the people who can help you. Like, we are the people who, and this meant that she wound up moving to Cortez Island, which is an incredibly remote, isolated community with an incredibly small number of people living there. And between what happened, like the way that things got set up in the trial, and that the questions around dependence on her therapists and these people who were now two of the very few people on the island, and the way that they seem to foster this ongoing dissolution of boundaries, and the notion of come over, engage socially, come over for dinner, just make sure that you call us beforehand. Like, these are not things, like in working on this project, when I've thought about my own relationship with therapists, and I've thought about the moments where I realized that I was wanting more than was appropriate from a therapeutic relationship, looking back on it retrospectively, I'm so fucking grateful to those people for, like, I remember having moments of like, oh, this person's so cool. I wish, we could hang out socially. They were in like a community of people that I knew, in such that I had been at their house prior socially, on their property anyway, not at their house. But then, like, the idea of like, ooh, what if this went there, and what if we could actually be friends? And not that I ever made the ask, but the way that they engaged precluded that as a possibility. And seeing how little of that, like understanding how little of that was there in these instances, has fostered my own gratitude for that willingness to hold boundaries, like, in a huge way.
Yeah, and also this behavior and these blurred boundaries and total lack of boundaries is exactly like the lack of boundaries that Francoise Borzat had as well. Another student of Roquette.
Which I want to say that, so much of part one really just speaks to the fact that there are many psychedelic practitioners who are effectively mistrained. And we see this with Jensen. It was incredibly well demonstrated with all of the time you all spent on Francoise Borzat and et al. Yeah.
Well, and it kind of, the parallels speak to, I assume, a lot of the therapists participating in the MAPS clinical trials were probably doing underground therapy. I don't know if that's anything that's provable, or coming up in similar circles at least.
Yeah, and I think, like, just to like, look, I've definitely heard, and I want to be clear, rumors and questions about to what extent clinical trial therapists are moonlighting in the underground, and I've certainly heard of people, like, I know of people who have worked, let's say, I'm blanking on the clinic down in I think Mexico, that does like psychedelic for addiction therapy, and or psychedelic therapy for addiction and whatnot. Crossroads, something like that.
Crossroads. It's no longer open. It was in Tijuana.
There we go. Like, I've heard stories about clinicians who are, or who are doing above ground research and work at some of those type places. So, like, there does seem to be some crossover. But I want to say, like, in this case of, like, the things that went down on Cortez Island, the fact that people at MAPS were aware that that Meaghan had moved to this island to be in close proximity with her study therapist. The fact that there was like, I mean, and we'll get into this more next week, but like how Jensen came to be the quote unquote acting principal investigator of this study site. I mean, just looking across the like this isn't a couple bad apples. This is like the things that it takes for these sorts of environments to like this is a whole environment that allows for this sort of behavior. It seemed to me that there is a pervasive unwillingness to engage with like proper ethical questions. And this is a thing that we have seen in the field, even as people in the field, whether it's North Star, whether it's, I mean, people who are promoting the idea that we need to have ethical conversations seem unable to articulate basic fundamentals of what they mean by ethics. The same way that people who are bringing up capitalism as a concern seem unable to actually articulate a coherent definition of what capitalism is. And so if we're going to talk about practitioner ethics, if we're going to talk about clinical trial design, like maybe we don't need to be looking within the psychedelic community to people who are saying this is so hard, we're just doing it for the first time. Maybe we need to be looking to bioethicists and people who understand clinical trial design and actual clinicians. How many clinicians are in the group of like psychedelic superstars? Like if you think the people of the people who are getting all of the attention for the psychedelic clinical trials or the psychedelic research, like how many of them are actually clinicians?
I want to talk about the just real quick about the earlier point about MAPS running propaganda for the psychedelic renaissance, like essentially trying to rehabilitate and destigmatize and valorize psychedelics, and what kind of biases that creates, in the sense that I think the idea is the entire culture has all of the negative stories about psychedelics, and ultimately, they don't feel a responsibility to feature or uplift or spend much time on the ways in which these substances and experiences can cause harm. First of all, it's counter to their mission, and second of all, it's it's just not good press. So, in that context, like just to speak briefly to what Dave was saying about the inability to do anything other than sort of broadly gesture at and invoke things that people have genuine concerns about, things like ethical violations, things like capitalism and the systemic harms that it can cause. Systemic harms and the what is it? Ethical violations. These are generalities, and there's a propaganda term called glittering generalities, where you tell very nice general stories that sell things, and anytime you get specific, that story is lost.
Yeah, I actually feel like we've seen some of that this last week. There have been a few. I don't want to get specific around them. They're there. If you've seen them, you've seen them. But there are stories that are going around about people who are claiming that they've known that these things were issues and that there were problems in the clinical trials and that they promoted, they're questioning whether or not they were right or wrong to promote them. But then they go on to make a sales pitch about their new integration service or their new course that's coming out that's going to train people, or buy their book, which will teach you how to do these things in whatever particular way. And to me, the notion of recuperating these realities for selling bullshit and selling like interventions or materials or anything in this sort of like broader industry that will just ultimately serves to perpetuate the industry and its existence, like it's not grappling with the real questions. And the real questions are, phase 2 and phase 3 are supposed to be getting into questions of can these interventions be done safely and effectively? And until we've answered those questions, I think the idea of a psychedelic industry is premature.
that sounds like a decent place to wrap.
Yeah, I think that was like a mic drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of stuff that was left dangling, and I just want to say I feel kind of weird because it feels like we're in process and that there's a lot more to come, and figuring out what is okay to talk about and not at the moment is making me feel super stressed on top of all the sleep debt and everything else. So
real quick, thank you so much for the participants for sharing their stories. It's so much.
And thank you to Lily and Dave for all the work you've been doing with Power Trip.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's unreal how much I've seen online people saying like, I've been aware of these things. I've read some of these stories in text before, but hearing like these people's voices and hearing these stories like in an audio format has like had so much of an impact on a whole lot of people. So it's clearly really important.
Yeah, and I really just do want to emphasize that this work would be utterly impossible without these folks' willingness to come forward.
Without the courage
to
of
do
them.
so.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like none of this should have happened, and it shouldn't take this to bring attention to these issues, and like the real disruption in people's lives to tell their stories is really significant. So really, like, I can't thank these people enough for what they're doing and how important it is. And I also just wish that none of it was necessary. On that note, tune in next week for
more
open heart surgery.
Yeah. We'll see how the sausage gets made.
That's right.
That's it. And fade.